I'm all good, but okay.
Yeah.
My,
Trying to figure that out too. So a lot to figure out. Oh, yeah. That clock's a little slow. So it's 5:59 right now.
Okay, so are we ready? You tell me if you're ready. Okay.
We are streaming.
Okay, if we could, come to order, please. We are now on TV, so we be quiet. Okay. All right. We are called to order. Will you call the roll for us, please, sir?
Mr. Anderson. Buck. Here. Carter.
Here.
Grant.
Here.
Mitchum.
Here.
Norton.
Here.
Stubblefield. We have a quorum.
Okay. All right. The purpose of the meeting tonight is to go over the zoning changes for the commercial area, and this is a joint meeting with City Council. And it is a work session. There will be no public comment, but we will be discussing what the proposal is, and then this will later on be voted on by City Council. You want to make a statement?
So this is a work session, so we won't have a back and forth or Q&A with the public. We won't take formal citizens' comments, but of course, if there's anything that comes up tonight that is new to you or you have questions about, feel free to email me or Jen, our zoning administrator, and we'll get answers to you. I can just jump right into it?
Yep. Yes, sir.
All right. So the purpose of this joint work session with City Council and the Planning Commission tonight is to review the ordinances that we've drafted to implement our proposed commercial district changes. We're about 5 months into this now. We've had a series of City Council meetings, Planning Commission meetings, joint work sessions with both those bodies to kind of come up with ideas of the what and where that we want to change in terms of the commercial district boundaries and the commercial district zoning regulations. And now we're at the phase that the ordinances are going to be officially going through the process with public hearings and out in the world. We just want to give you guys an idea of what the actual ordinances look like and the timeline for adoption, and just one more chance to put it all together for folks. We are going to send out about 200 packages of public notices in the next week and a half. We have to notice all these property owners, we have to notice adjacent property owners. Everyone's going to be getting a lot of notices. You're going to see signs popping up all over the commercial district. I can guarantee you that as members of the Planning Commission and City Council, you will get questions. So we wanted to give you guys a kind of comprehensive overview of what's happening one more time so you can answer those questions when you go ahead and direct them back to us. So thank you, Wes. First up, we'll review the proposed zoning district boundary changes. So there are a handful of changes to the areas on the zoning map. These are few and far between in Folly history, so I'd say this is the most significant rework of the actual boundary lines, at least since I've been here in the last 20 years. The first step, this is covered by ordinances 1022, 1222, and 1322. We're going to do this in kind of a couple of parts. Over there on the screen or in your packets, you have a map called current zoning and one called proposed zoning. It's some blue on it. Oh yeah, thank you. And if you're streaming this, you can pull these documents up online. I don't know which camera to look at, but if you're streaming this, you can look online on the city calendar, and then all these documents are there for you to follow along with us at home. Thank you, Jen. So the proposed, this first part of the proposed zoning changes has 3 parts. The block of Center Street between Ashley and Arctic, which is currently IC, will be zoned to DC. That's ordinance 13-22. The lots, there's really no elegant way to refer to it. The lots behind the alleyway on east and west, these are lots beyond this first alleyway off Center Street on east and west that are currently zoned DC will change to IC. And that's ordinance 1022. And then to implement the DC district regulations that were proposed to only apply to properties along Center Street, we're proposing a Center Street overlay, which would float on that DC district, and it's there in blue. It's all the lots that touch Center Street, or those handful of lots that are between Center Street and the alley. Not all of the properties on Center Street go from Center Street to the alley. There are a few where they're actual separate parcels. So this first slide shows three things. Block between Ashley and Arctic on Center Street goes from IC to DC. The lots behind the alleyway, east and west, go from DC to IC. And then everything that touches Center Street or is behind Center Street before the alleyway goes to the Center Street overlay. Everybody follow that? Any questions on just those changes? All right, can we move over to the next slide? I kind of jumped ahead of myself a little bit. We talked about the lots behind the alleyway. And then the other zoning district boundary change is there on the proposed map on this slide. It says proposed second block west. Right now, the second block west between Arctic and Ashley is IC. You can see that on the current zoning map. It goes down towards our bathrooms at 3rd Street. The proposal is to change that block from IC to DC. And that would happen ordinance 822. You'll see on the proposed map that the first block of East Ashley there in red, which is currently DC, will remain DC. They're not being rezoned. We do have some text amendments to the DC district, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but no changes to that first block of East Ashley. So this slide kind of adds the second block of west it's the second block west between Ashley and Arctic. So this last map here that says proposed second block west change to RTF, this captures all the district boundary changes we're proposing. Second block west between Ashley and Arctic goes from IC to residential 2 families. First block of Center Street between Arctic and Ashley goes from IC to DC. Properties behind the alleyway flip from DC to IC, and then the overlay gets laid on top of properties along Center Street. Does anyone have any questions about the zoning boundary changes? Anybody?
Some people may not realize that 10-foot easement runs all the way from the bridge to Arctic Avenue, and it is a 10-foot easement. Most of it has our sewer lines in it, our water lines in it, our underground power for Center Street. All of that is run in that alleyway, and some people walk on them now. Most of them have been open, so they walk on them. So that is what he's talking about when he's talking about that little 10-foot strip.
And the first block is unique. We actually have 2 10-foot easements in the first block, one right behind Center Street and another one in the mid block. All the other blocks only have one mid block alley. But in the first block, we've got this extra one that runs behind Center Street. So in the terms of this, in the context of this rezoning, when we talk about 10-foot easement or the alleyway or the right of way behind Center Street, it's this one that runs right behind the lots on Center Street. A lot of it's open for driving through. But before we get into the text changes, I just want to make sure everyone had a good idea of which properties are going to now be in what zones. Okay. So now that we know how things are proposed to be rezoned or not rezoned, we can go over the text changes that will apply to each of the districts. First up is the Center Street overlay. As we worked through this, there were a handful of changes proposed for the overall DC district, and through the various workshops and meetings, they were kind of sorted into 2 baskets. The ones that only apply to Center Street, and the ones that apply to the remainder of the DC district, which will now basically be the first block of East Ashley. At the end of the day, most of them only apply to the Center Street district, and it just got really awkward to try to amend the DC district in all the different places to say this one applies just to Center Street, this one only applies to East Ashley. So the simplest solution was to create an overlay that will float on top of the DC district along Center Street.
You have a question, Ms. House? Okay.
Just a clarification.
So floating over DC along Center Street to the alley is the Center Street overlay. And within that district, new buildings are proposed to be required to be flood-proofed at grade rather than elevated. You can kind of see the difference in McKellen's, which used to be in the B zone, and that's why it's elevated. And even Center Street, or City Hall, is an elevated building. It's harder to tell from the street versus Avocet. So since this is our main street, our main pedestrian avenue, we want to keep that street wall kind of solid. So we're going to propose that any new construction on Center Street or a couple of lots behind it be flood-proof at grade rather than elevated. We will limit the height of new buildings to 34 feet from grade for 2 stories. Throughout this, we're now treating rooftop decks as stories. So if you have a 2-story building, you could not then add a rooftop deck on it because that would make you a 3-story building. You want a rooftop deck for music and entertainment, that counts as a full story. So you can have a 1-story building with a rooftop deck on top of it.
What's the height limit now?
It's, depending on the use, it's either 34 feet from the first finished floor or 40 feet from the first finished floor. City Hall is built to 40 feet from BFE, so it's probably 43 or 44 feet above grade. So it would create lower buildings along Center Street to match the historical pattern of development. Most of the buildings on Center Street, City Hall might be the tallest one. The majority of buildings on Center Street are much lower than our current height limit. In the case of massive redevelopment, we didn't want all the new buildings on Center Street to be as tall as City Hall is now. Another proposal for the new Center Street overlay is to encourage public and semi-public spaces at the sidewalk by exempting them from lot coverage totals. The lot coverage limit for lots in this district is 50%. You can cover 50% of a lot with impervious surfaces. The last time we got a new commercial building on Center Street, it was Avocet down at 36 Center Street. They got a variance to add that porch. They got more lot coverage than they were allowed in order to add that kind of semi-public porch, and it's really turned out well. People use it, people still in rocking chairs. We want to encourage more of those type spaces. So if you develop or redevelop a lot on Center Street, and you add a porch, deck, seating area, courtyard, garden, anything at the street, any impervious area in that area, or impervious surface in that area would not count towards your total lot coverage. We're eliminating multifamily use along Center Street. That's multifamily as a standalone use. There aren't really truly a lot of lots on Center Street, if any, that have enough lot area to support multifamily use. But just in case in the future a lot gets combined, we're starting to see new numbers in real estate out here. So if there's any kind of parcel aggregation, we don't want multifamily development on Center Street. And that would also cover that block between Arctic and Ashley, which is going to be included now when it's not previously. We also propose to eliminate standalone residential units on Center Street. So if you did decide to build a house on Center Street or a duplex on Center Street, you could do that, but it had to be over commercial space, depending on if you've got enough lot area to support the inside. But no purely residential development on our small, limited commercial main streets. And we don't want to give up any more space on Center Street to single-use residential uses. And then removing the parking requirements for all uses except for residential. And basically, Center Street was developed without parking requirements. That's how we got the situation that you see out the windows with 100% lot coverage. Center Street never had parking requirements. In 2010, we made parking requirements for the DC district, which is Center Street's a part of it, and we inadvertently froze development on Center Street. In 2018, we said, we'll fix that. We'll go back to the good old days of no parking. And we removed parking requirements again from DC, where we didn't think about the lots that weren't on the street, and then we got a large restaurant with no parking. We kind of reacted by putting the parking requirements back, saying one day in the future, we'll address this split between Center Street and the rest of the DC district. Well, the future is now, so the Center Street overlay proposes that just for these lots here on Center Street, between Center Street and the alley, there's no parking requirements. Unless it's residential use, where we know those will generate the need for parking. So those are the zoning text changes for the new Center Street overlay. Anybody have any questions on those? All right, those again, that would apply to Center Street from the bridge all the way up to Arctic to the alleyways on each side. And then the remainder of the DC district, which is that first block of East Ashley, there are a few kind of important changes being proposed for those properties too. One would be the increase in all the setbacks to 10 feet. So basically going from the situation that we have now where residential uses have 5 or 10 foot setbacks and non-residential uses have no setbacks, we would have a flat 10-foot setback all around in the DC district in that block. And those 10-foot setbacks are consistent right now through the rest of the zoning, except for IC, but in our existing code, except for in DC, if you do a residential use, you have a setback, but if you do a non-residential use, you don't have a setback. So this would propose 10-foot setback all around for all uses in the DC district. And we're also removing multifamily use as an allowable use in the DC district also because of our zoning quirk, which allows multifamily housing to be built to the zoning envelope maximum independent of setbacks and height and lot coverage. And you can see that kind of happening at the post office and across the street. Those properties were able to be developed because they qualify as multifamily because they have 3 units. Had they been a duplex, 2 units, they would have had a square footage cap. They would have had a greater setback. If we were parking our zoning code, 2 units are capped, 3 units are not. So this would remove multifamily use as an allowable option for that first block of East Ashley to close that loophole. And then we also require in the DC district the development of pedestrian pathways as part of redevelopment or new construction in the DC district. This is similar to the sidewalk and multi-use path requirement that already exists on Folly Road. It's used by the town of Mount Pleasant, City of Charleston County, town of James Island. Many jurisdictions in the state use this requirement as a way to incrementally install sidewalks and pedestrian facilities. So those are the changes for the DC district, which is that first block of East Ashley down to Berks. We don't have any questions about those. The next slide. These are changes to the IC district. So the IC district, or as our second Old Island commercial district, it would now exclude the second block west between Ashley and Arctic, and it would include the second half of the first block here, which is flipping from DC to IC. So those properties would now be subject to these changes. Building heights would be limited to 40 feet from the center line of the nearest public street, or 3 stories. Parking areas below buildings count as a story, and rooftop decks count as a story. So that's meant to prohibit 3 stories on top of parking. I know I keep referring to the windows, but
For cleaning lunch.
Yeah.
That could be what you're looking at, yeah.
The three stories. So just to lower the scale of new development and the massing of new development, the side setbacks would increase to 10 feet, similar to in the DC district. There are already front and rear setbacks, and there's no side setbacks in that district, so this would increase side setbacks to 10 feet. And then would also require new development in that commercial district to provide pedestrian improvement. So changes in the IC district basically boil down to lowering the height of the building, lowering the overall foot of the building by squeezing in on the side wall or the side setbacks, and then requiring pedestrian improvements. Anybody have any questions on those changes? Okay. this last change is an amendment to the substantial damage rule, which is over in chapter 168, and it would apply that to multifamily uses in the RTF zone. And the reason we need this is because that second block west between Ashland and Arcade now is the majority of that block is developed as multi-unit buildings. So they vastly exceed the allowable density in the RTF zone, which is a duplex. So we have an exemption in our code today for non-conforming uses in the IC and the DC districts to be rebuilt in the case of a major disaster. And that exemption was written in to protect multifamily housing in those districts. So as it says today, those multifamily units are in the IC district, and they have an exemption written into the code saying they can be rebuilt because they're in the IC district. If we rezone that block to residential two-family, they would lose that exemption. So in order to protect the ability of those multifamily projects to be rebuilt, we need to mirror the existing exemption for commercial districts in the RTF district. There are a handful of other properties that would be allowed to be replaced under that exemption, which would not be allowed today. Sellers, or the Holiday Inn, the 2L Holiday Inn, is currently zoned residential two-family and exceeds the maximum density. So when we write an exemption that allows the multifamily in the second block to come back, we would also then be exempting any existing triplexes, quadruplexes that are scattered throughout the RTF zone. There's no way to write it specifically for that block. It needs to apply to that entire zoning district. So that's what that change is. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. Well, those are our proposed zoning district boundary changes, and the proposed amendments to the actual zones themselves. So where would we go after tonight? The advertisements are actually in the paper already. We posted published notice for all these public hearings prior to the 4/2 deadline. We're having our joint work session tonight on 4/4. Between now and 4/15, we're going to be mailing the notices for all of these ordinances to every property owner that's affected. And we'll go over that in just 1 second. And not only to all the property owners, but to all the owners of apartments within 150 feet of those property owners. It's about 200 notices. Because of the requirement that we have to notice the property and the neighbors, we got a lot of cross-pollination between those lists where I'm just going to make up names here. Ms. Kennedy got notice of ordinance 08 because it applied to her property, but she also got notice of 13 and 14 because she was a neighbor. Mr. Buck got notices of 13 and 14 because he was the owner, but also 9 and 10 because he was a neighbor. There's a lot of, because all these are together. So what we're going to do is we're going to mail all the notices to everyone. All the neighbors and all the property owners will get all of the notices, so they will all be notified of everything we're doing. So we've got that written up, and we'll go over it in a minute. But I just know that once those letters go out, we're all going to get a lot of calls. So that's happening in the next 2 weeks, and then we're going to have to post signs. The actual public hearings are scheduled for the Planning Commission meeting in May. It's May 2nd. So on May 2nd, the Planning Commission will formally hear these things. They'll hold the formal public hearings where the public's invited to come and give testimony, and they'll make their recommendations back to council on adoption. They'll come back to the city council meeting on May 10th. First reading and any amendments that may arise out of those public hearings will be made pending, and that's just in time for the expiration of the moratorium later that week. And then they'll be back for second reading on June the 7th. And one thing that's not on that list, next Tuesday at the city council meeting, they're all on the city council agenda purely to be remanded to the planning commission. There won't be any discussion or debate. We're just remanded to the planning commission for that public hearing on 5/2.
And if it passes first reading on May 10th,
It'll be made pending. All of these are zoning ordinances, so they can be made pending under the pending ordinance document or doctrine. So on May 10th, if they pass first reading, we will begin treating them as enforceable.
If y'all get backed up a little bit, we can extend the moratorium a month, correct?
Right.
If we need to go an extra month, I hate for y'all to get burnt out answering questions where anybody's not comfortable to do that fast. I mean, we want something done, we can postpone the moratorium a month if we need to, make sure everybody's comfortable with it. You know, at least understands, not to be comfortable with everybody, but understand at least the full capacity of what's happening. There's a lot of nuts and bolts.
And if, once these notices goes out, if they're, say on ordinance 822, we're getting a ton of questions, and ordinance 922, no one's really asking, we can split those public hearing meetings up. We'll have to actually start them on the second, because it's advertising, but we could postpone them and continue it the next day, or the next week if needed.
Gotcha.
So that's our rough schedule. And then I'd like to go over and take feedback on the public notice that we intend to mail out. That's the letter that was included in the packet. This is the notice that we are hoping to send to all affected property owners. And because everyone is getting so many public notices, we wanted to kind of walk through, if you live here, this is what you should read. So it's broken down to if your property is located between Center Street and the alleys, see these public notices. This is the summary of the changes. If you live on the second block west, or thinking, actually, these are your public notices. See the changes. So if anyone had a chance to review that prior to the meeting and has any feedback, we'll take it now. Otherwise, you got probably a week and a half to read it over, see if it makes sense to you. If you were getting this in your post office box in Ohio, about your property on Folly Beach, would you know what was happening if you got this letter? Any constructive or non-constructive feedback is welcome. We just want to make sure this is as clear and as legible as possible when it hits people who have not necessarily been following along with our meetings. In the rest of the packet,
Is there some kind of a requirement on giving notice so many days before some action is taken?
Yep. It has to be published 30 days before and mailed and written 15 days before. Mailed and posted. So sometime around the 15th, Jenna and I are going to be going around all these properties and hammering signs and things around. And that's probably when people will really start to pay attention.
Thank you.
And then the rest of the packet are the ordinances themselves. Just for discussion purposes. We'll go one by one. Ordinance 722 creates the exemption for multifamily housing in RTF district. And you can see here that exemption already exists in the residential multifamily, the DC and IC district. We just need to mirror it for the RTF district if we make that entire block non-conforming. Ordinance 8 and all the rest of the rezoning ordinances, there's really not a lot of content in the rezoning ordinances. It just lists the tax map and the owners that are affected. So basically this ordinance says, we're proposing to rezone the following parcels from this to this. These are the owners. So kind of straightforward on that. There's no real content to those. Ordinance 922 is implementing. This changes the dimensional standard for Island Commercial District. So this is where we get those increased setbacks and lower height. And also it amends the footnote. Kind of the meat of this is in the footnote for the height table. That say that rooftops and parking areas count as floors. We need to start talking about maximum 2 floors or maximum 3 floors. 1022 is a rezoning, it's a list of parcels. 1122 removes multifamily use from the IC district. And it's just amending the use. It's kind of subtle there. See on the residential use classification, a little strike through on that P. So it will no longer be permitted. Ordinance 1222 creates the Center way, and implements each one of those things we talked about earlier. 13 and 14 are rezonings, tax map numbers. And then 15 is the requirement for pedestrian improvements. Joe has reviewed this and signed off on it. We may propose an amendment at the public hearing just to clarify some of the language, but the gist of this is the development and redevelopment in DC and IC districts will be required to install pedestrian improvements in the right of way. And that's you can see that in action up and down Folly Road. When you see the new buildings with the sidewalk in front of them, that's kind of what we're aiming for.
Are we trying to go to sidewalks for what we're asking the people, or are we gonna do what's on Second Street?
Well, it's worded in here as a 12-foot wide pedestrian path.
Okay, so
Sometimes
we can
use
decide what we
sidewalks.
want to do with it. Okay.
The proposal as it stands is that the city is gonna have the conceptual design done for the entire district, and then the owner will be in charge of constructing their portion of that conceptual design.
And this, construction only comes when something new is being done to the property, correct?
So either new construction or substantial improvement could cover 50% of that.
And we do have the design for from Center Street to Burt's Market for that pathway.
That was under construction,
Okay.
or will be soon.
Eric says yes.
They have started.
Okay.
Very small.
So I know when we started this, I don't think we quite envisioned nine ordinances and moving pieces. But I think when you put it on paper, it's a lot of ordinances, but what they're doing is relatively brief, compared to how we started. We're making 3 or 4 changes to the boundaries, changing the side setbacks and the height in the Island Commercial District. We're looking at height limits and parking, some design stuff in the Center Street District and pedestrian improvements. So we kind of boiled it down to just a handful of things.
Does anybody have any more questions?
Yeah, Aaron, reconstruction after damage, the new constrained downtown commercial, I think there's only one property that fits this bill, which is McKevlin's. That's elevated. Currently, I know that's not our desire moving forward. If that property were damaged by more than 50%, they would be allowed to rebuild elevated as it is today.
The way our ordinances are written, substantial damage triggers coming into conformance. So that damage, it would become legally non-conforming because it's not elevated. If it's substantially damaged, which is 50% or more of the value of the structure, in order to rebuild it or restore it, they would have to come into conformity and be built at grade. They could always apply for a variance.
Okay, so the limited exception doesn't apply to them. I think this is, I believe this is 07, 00722, which deals with multifamily. So I don't think it would apply to them. Just want to clarify that.
Those are the exemption allows a non-conforming use to return. It doesn't deal with setbacks, height, that sort of thing. So McKellen's is a conforming use. They're just built in a non-conforming way, right? What it will be if we make past that requirement.
Right. So just to clarify, if it was damaged by more than 50%, we would require it to be built at grade like all other properties facing the center. Good.
City Hall is elevated.
Although it doesn't seem like it, but yes, it is.
Yeah, this City Hall is deceptive because it doesn't look like it is, right?
And then also, did we remedy, I know we've spoken about this in the past, properties that are, again, in the new downtown commercial constrained district, the side setbacks, insofar as that space that could exist between 2 buildings that wouldn't allow for maintenance? Is that not in here?
Yes, sir. There are now 10-foot setbacks required.
Well, I saw that, and I thought that applied to Ashley from Center.
Yeah, that's
Second.
downtown commercial. So you mean on Center Street?
Correct, on
On
Center.
Center Street, we're still proposing 0.
Is that in here or is that separate?
it should be in here. If it's not, the intent is definitely for the Center Street overlay to maintain 0-foot setback. And it may need to go into table 165.
Is that the 16501?
Yeah, so the Center Street overlay will have to be added to table 165, I think, point that out, but the Center Street overlay is not written to contemplate a 10-foot setback on Center Street.
Right. So, that of course would be problematic, but I think similarly, in certain circumstances, this 0-foot side setback is problematic. So if you had an existing structure that was 1 foot from their side property line, and a new one was built at 0 feet, it then prohibits any maintenance of either structure on that side. So we talked about potentially having a minimum of maybe 2 feet from each property line.
I didn't remember that applied to Center Street. So,
Yeah, we talked about in the context of, you know, a perfect world, buildings would be built side to side with a impenetrable membrane on top. And if that couldn't be the case, you could build that, you know, call it 1 feet. Like
Well,
the issue we have on the side of our building.
Right now, the ordinances are the ordinances. They're going back to the planning commission for a public hearing. So when they come back from the planning commission, if you want to try to make that amendment, that's the time to talk about making the amendment.
and you would essentially be creating a setback for Center Street, that's what you're discussing.
That's what we're talking about.
Or eliminate.
Well, we have 0.
So 0, 0.
Or a requirement that they do,
Well, even if they built at their property line, the problem is that the adjacent property hasn't also built at that property line. You then could have a 6-inch foot, 2 foot.
Well, you have that with the taco board building in the condos next door. That's why we want to put side setbacks on that way for any kind of residential buildings for maintenance. But my concern more especially is like firefighting. Because if you can't get in between them, one structure burns 2 structures down. But like I said, the time to make that amendment, it isn't now, it's later.
we'll definitely have that lined up for discussion.
Okay, good, thank you.
Does this impact at all in front of the food trucks, where usually people need to get by and it's very crowded? So, no,
This ordinance.
doesn't touch.
But we have another ordinance that does that, and Mr. Lutz, and then we're trying to get that all enforced now.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any comments?
So, next week, we manage the planning commission, public hearings on May 2nd. As we just kind of work through a hypothetical, these are proposed, they can still be amended. Planning commission can make recommendations to city council for amendment, city council can amend them. So for everybody who's following along, May planning commission, May city council, that's the time to come and give your input to those bodies for possible amendments. In the meantime, if you have any questions, just email me or Jenna, we'll get you the answers.
Any other comments from the commission? Mr. Grant? You gonna move to adjourn?
Okay, I'll move to adjourn.
Oh, this is.
Sorry about that.
Second.
When you were done. I know, yeah. 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 So I wasn't exactly sure what we're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate it.